My mother-in-law humiliated me with cruel jokes disguised as humor for 10 years at every family event, but I've had enough. My mother-in-law Dorothy thought she was hilarious. Every family gathering, she'd make jokes about my weight, my job, my cooking, my parenting, always followed by, "Lighten up, it's just a joke," when anyone looked uncomfortable. When I married her son Blake, she stood up at our wedding reception and said she was surprised Blake found someone willing to marry him for love instead of money since he didn't have any, then looked at me and said, "Oh, wait." Everyone laughed nervously while she beamed like she'd delivered the best toast ever. For 10 years, Dorothy's jokes got worse. She'd introduce me as Blake's first wife, then laugh saying she was kidding but statistics didn't lie. She'd tell my kids that mommy couldn't help with math homework because some people just weren't born smart. She'd announce at dinner that she made extra food since I'd probably eat everyone's leftovers anyway. When our daughter Lily was born premature and spent weeks in NICU, Dorothy visited once and joked that Lily was trying to escape already. She said maybe the baby knew something we didn't about her parents. Blake would weakly tell his mom to stop, but Dorothy would say he'd lost his sense of humor since marrying me. Every holiday became a performance where Dorothy was the comedian and I was the punchline. Christmas meant jokes about my gifts being cheap because teachers don't make real money. Thanksgiving meant comments about me eating for two when I wasn't pregnant. Easter meant cracks about me probably hiding eggs because I was good at hiding my real personality until after the wedding. Birthday parties meant Dorothy telling everyone the story of how Blake could have married his ex Rachel, but settled for me instead. She'd always end with kidding, but nobody ever laughed. Blake's dad Richard would stare at his plate while Blake's sister Amy would suddenly need to check on something in another room. I tried everything to make Dorothy stop. I asked her privately to be kinder, and she said I was too sensitive for my own good. I tried joking back, but she'd get offended and tell everyone I was mean to her. I tried ignoring the jokes, but she'd repeat them louder, thinking I hadn't heard. Blake tried talking to her, but she'd cry about how nobody appreciated her humor anymore, and everyone was so serious these days. She'd promise to be better, then show up to the next event with fresh material about my failures. The breaking point was Lily's 5th birthday. Dorothy arrived late and announced she'd been thinking about how Lily looked nothing like our family, so maybe the mailman was involved. She laughed at her own joke while 5-year-olds stared confused and other parents looked horrified. When Blake told her to apologize, Dorothy said it was just observational humor, and we needed to teach Lily not to be soft like her mother. That night, I decided to stop responding to Dorothy completely. Not silent treatment, just absolute non-reaction to anything she said that was meant to be funny. The next family dinner, Dorothy made her usual entrance with a joke about my outfit looking like I'd raided a donation bin. I continued cutting vegetables like she hadn't spoken. She repeated it louder. I asked Amy about her new job. Dorothy made another crack about my cooking, probably poisoning everyone. I kept stirring the pot while discussing the weather with Richard. Dorothy's face got red, but she kept trying. Every joke landed in silence from me while I had normal conversations with everyone else. Blake's family noticed immediately. Without my forced laughter or hurt reactions, Dorothy's jokes hung in the air like dead birds. Richard started clearing his throat after each one. Amy would immediately change the subject. Blake would look at his mom with disappointment. Dorothy's jokes got more desperate. She'd practically shout them across the table, but I'd just continue eating and talking to others about normal things. She'd repeat punchlines thinking I'd miss them. She'd explain why something was funny while I passed dishes around her explanations. Family dinners became excruciatingly awkward for everyone except me. I was having lovely conversations while Dorothy performed to a dead room. Dorothy started complaining to everyone that I was giving her the silent treatment. Blake corrected her, saying I talked to her about normal things just fine. I just didn't respond to jokes. Richard said maybe that meant the jokes weren't funny. Amy suggested Dorothy try being sincere instead of always performing. Dorothy said they'd all lost their sense of humor because of my influence. She started bringing other people to dinners to audience her comedy. Her sister Louise came once, heard Dorothy's routine about my inadequacies, and asked Dorothy why she was so cruel to her daughter-in-law. Dorothy said it was just jokes, but Louise said jokes were supposed to be funny, not just mean. Dorothy's friends stopped accepting dinner invitations after witnessing the awkward spectacle of Dorothy performing to my non-response. The situation exploded at Dorothy's retirement party. She'd been an office manager for 30 years and planned this huge celebration. She asked Blake to give a speech about growing up with such a funny, vibrant mother. She wanted family photos and memories shared. She'd rented a hall and invited 100 people. The week before, she cornered me and said I'd better laugh at her retirement speech because she had prepared special material about our family. I said I looked forward to hearing it. The retirement party hall buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses, while Dorothy moved through clusters of her former coworkers like she was working a campaign trail. She touched shoulders and laughed at things people said, but her eyes kept darting back to where Blake and I stood by the refreshment table. I watched her force brightness into every gesture, saw how she held herself too stiff, like she was bracing for impact. Blake's fingers laced through mine and squeezed once, a silent acknowledgement that we both knew what was coming. Dorothy had promised special material about our family, and she'd been planning this moment for weeks. The hall was packed with people who'd worked with her for 3 decades, people who only knew the funny office manager version of Dorothy, not the woman who made mailman jokes at children's birthday parties. I sipped my punch and felt Blake's tension radiating through his hand into mine. Dorothy appeared beside us an hour later, materializing so suddenly that Blake startled. Her voice came out tight and higher than normal when she asked when he was giving his speech. She needed this day to be perfect, she said. Everyone was watching. Family was supposed to support each other during important moments. Blake told her he'd speak when it was time, his voice flat and non-committal. I watched Dorothy scan his face, searching for the reassurance she'd always gotten from him, the promise that he'd smooth things over and make her look good no matter what. She didn't find it. Her mouth tightened and she walked away quickly, her heels clicking sharp against the floor. Richard found me at the dessert table 15 minutes later while I was arranging cookies on a plate. He stood beside me quietly for a moment before saying he was proud of how I'd handled everything these past months. His voice was low, meant just for me. He admitted he should have stopped Dorothy years ago, but didn't know how, and now he was watching her panic because she finally had to face a room without guaranteed laughter from me. The honesty in his words surprised me more than the words themselves. Richard had spent a decade staring at his plate while his wife performed cruelty, and now he was acknowledging it out loud. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and he nodded once before walking away with his own plate of cookies. The venue coordinator tapped the microphone and announced Dorothy's retirement speech. The room fell silent except for the scraping of chairs as people turned toward the small stage. Dorothy climbed the 3 steps carefully, gripping the railing and took the microphone with both hands. She launched into prepared remarks about her wonderful career, about the amazing people she'd worked with, about how grateful she was for 30 years in this office. She started peppering in jokes about Blake's childhood, about how he used to hide vegetables in his napkin, about Richard's quirks like falling asleep during every movie. The audience laughed politely at the harmless stories. Dorothy's confidence grew with each chuckle. She straightened her shoulders and her voice got stronger as she built toward what I knew was coming. Dorothy shifted her focus to stories about me, and her tone stayed light, but gained an edge that her coworkers didn't quite catch. She joked about how Blake married someone who makes teacher salary, about how I probably give my students the same bland lessons I serve at dinner, about how grateful she was that Blake found someone despite his limited options. I continued sipping my punch and chatting quietly with Amy beside me, asking about her new apartment downtown. Amy's voice was soft when she answered, her eyes on her mother at the microphone. Dorothy's coworkers glanced between us, starting to notice that the daughter-in-law wasn't reacting to these stories about herself. The jokes kept coming, and Dorothy's voice got louder as she pushed through her prepared material. She made cracks about my cooking, about my weight, about my intelligence, each one landing in the room differently than they landed at family dinners. Without my reaction, without my forced laughter or hurt expression, the jokes hung in the air like something rotten. Dorothy's coworkers shifted in their seats, glancing at each other with uncomfortable expressions as they realized these weren't affectionate family stories. Louise, sitting near the front, stopped smiling entirely and stared at her sister with visible disappointment. A woman I didn't recognize leaned over to whisper something to her husband, both of them frowning. Dorothy made a joke about Lily probably getting her looks from the mailman, recycling her birthday party material for this new audience. Several people gasped out loud. I saw Lana, who I recognized as Dorothy's former colleague from the photos in the hallway, physically recoil in her seat like she'd been slapped. The room went completely silent, not the anticipatory silence before a punchline, but the horrified silence after something unforgivable. Dorothy seemed to finally realize her audience wasn't with her. Her smile froze and her eyes scanned the room, seeing confusion and discomfort instead of the admiration she'd expected. She tried to recover by saying everyone's too sensitive these days, that humor is dying in this politically correct world, that her family knows she's just kidding around. But the damage was done and spreading through the room like spilled wine. I watched her scan the faces staring back at her, watched her see what I'd been seeing at family dinners for months now. Richard was staring at his plate exactly like he does at our table, his face red. Louise looked like she wanted to climb on stage and drag her sister off. Lana had her hand over her mouth. The venue coordinator stood by the wall looking deeply uncomfortable. Dorothy wrapped up her speech quickly, stumbling over her prepared ending about family love and support. The words rang hollow after what everyone just witnessed, like she was reading from a script that no longer made sense. The applause was scattered and brief, a few people clapping out of obligation before stopping. Dorothy returned to her seat with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, her hands shaking slightly as she set down the microphone. Blake squeezed my hand hard enough that it almost hurt, and I could feel him steeling himself for what came next. The venue coordinator announced that Blake Morris would now speak about his mother, her voice uncertain like she wasn't sure this was still a good idea. Blake walked to the microphone with the note cards he'd been agonizing over for weeks, the ones he'd rewritten 4 times. Dorothy sat up straighter at her table, clearly hoping he'd redeem the awkward moment she'd created, that he'd smooth everything over like he always had. I watched my husband take a breath at the microphone, watched him look at his mother, and watched him make his choice about what kind of man he wanted to be. Blake walked to the microphone and adjusted it slightly, his hand steady despite what I knew was happening inside him. He looked out at the crowd of Dorothy's coworkers and family, took a breath and started talking about his mother being complicated. A few people chuckled like they knew exactly what he meant, recognizing something in his tone that wasn't quite celebration. He described growing up in a house where being funny was the only way to get attention, where making people laugh meant you mattered, where sitting quietly at dinner meant you might as well not exist. Dorothy's smile stayed frozen on her face, but I watched her eyes start scanning the room like she was trying to figure out where this was going. Blake's voice stayed calm, and even as he talked about learning early that humor in their house wasn't about joy, it was about survival and control. He shifted his weight and looked down at his note cards, then back up at the audience without reading from them. Blake told a story about being 12 and completely failing a school presentation on the solar system, forgetting his lines and standing frozen in front of the class until the teacher let him sit down. He came home feeling awful about himself, already dreading having to tell his parents what happened. Dorothy made it the centerpiece of dinner conversation, making jokes about how Blake must have been nervous because he wasn't born to perform like she was, suggesting maybe he got his stage fright from Richard's side of the family. She kept going even when Blake stopped eating, turning his worst day into her best material, while Amy stared at her plate, and Richard cleared his throat repeatedly. Blake said that was the night he learned his feelings didn't matter as much as his mother's need for an audience, that his pain was just raw material for her next routine. The room went completely silent, and I could see people leaning forward in their chairs, no longer politely listening but actually hearing what he was saying. Dorothy's face had lost all its color and she gripped her napkin in both hands like she was trying to hold on to something solid. He talked about watching the same pattern repeat with me for 10 years, how every family gathering became a performance where his wife was the punchline and everyone else was forced to be the audience. Blake said he was ashamed it took him so long to really stop it, that he'd made excuses about her sense of humor being just her personality, that he'd asked me to be patient instead of demanding his mother change. His voice got quieter, but somehow more powerful, as he admitted he'd chosen protecting his mother's feelings over protecting his family, and that was wrong. Dorothy's hands were shaking now, and her knuckles had gone white from how hard she was gripping that napkin. Richard reached toward her, but she didn't seem to notice, just stared straight ahead at Blake like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. People around the room were nodding slightly, and I saw Lana wipe at her eyes. Blake looked directly at his mother and said he loved her, but he didn't like how she treated people. That love and cruelty shouldn't exist in the same space the way they did in our family. He said retirement was a chance for her to figure out who she was when she wasn't performing, when she didn't have an audience to impress, or people to use as props in her comedy routine. His voice was gentle but firm when he said he hoped she'd choose to build real relationships, instead of treating everyone like they existed to make her feel funny and important. Blake said he wanted his kids to know their grandmother as someone kind, not someone they had to protect themselves from at birthday parties. Then he thanked everyone for coming to celebrate her retirement and walked back to his seat beside me without waiting for applause. I took his hand and squeezed it hard, feeling him trembling slightly now that the speech was over. The room erupted in genuine applause that was nothing like the scattered clapping after Dorothy's speech. People were clapping hard and long, some standing up, clearly moved by what Blake had said. Dorothy sat frozen at the head table like someone had turned her to stone, her retirement party completely destroyed from what she'd imagined it would be. She'd pictured everyone laughing at her jokes and Blake giving a sweet speech about what a wonderful mother she was, maybe some tears of joy and gratitude. Instead, she was sitting in front of 100 people who'd just heard her son explain exactly how cruel she'd been for years. Richard reached for her hand again, and this time she yanked hers away, staring straight ahead at nothing while her carefully planned celebration fell apart around her. People started coming over to us instead of going to congratulate Dorothy. They told Blake he was brave for speaking honestly, asked me quietly if I was okay, said things like they'd always wondered about Dorothy's family stories. Lana came over looking upset and apologized for not seeing what was really happening, saying she'd always thought Dorothy exaggerated her family stories for effect at work. She said if she'd known Dorothy was actually that cruel at home, she would have said something sooner. I told her I appreciated her saying something now, and she looked genuinely distressed, like she was rethinking every conversation she'd ever had with Dorothy. More people approached with similar sentiments, creating a small crowd around Blake and me while Dorothy sat alone at the head table. The venue coordinator looked uncomfortable and kept checking her watch like she was hoping people would start leaving soon. Dorothy suddenly stood up and walked quickly toward the bathroom, her heels clicking loud against the floor in the awkward silence she left behind. She was gone for 20 minutes while the party continued in this strange, subdued way, people eating cake and talking in low voices. When she finally came back, her makeup was fixed and perfect again, but her eyes were red and slightly swollen. She moved through the rest of the party like a ghost going through motions, accepting congratulations on her retirement with mechanical politeness that had none of her usual energy. People would say something nice about her years of service, and she'd say thank you in this flat voice. Then they'd awkwardly move away. The energy had completely shifted from celebration to something uncomfortable and sad, and people started leaving earlier than the party was supposed to end. Louise cornered Dorothy near the coat check area, and I was close enough to overhear their conversation. Louise said that speech was a wake-up call, that their mother had used humor as a weapon too, and Dorothy had sworn she'd be different with her own kids. Dorothy's voice got sharp when she snapped back that Louise didn't understand, that everyone was too sensitive these days, that Blake had humiliated her at her own retirement party in front of everyone she worked with. Louise said Blake told the truth, and maybe that was the real problem, that Dorothy couldn't handle hearing honest feedback about her behavior. Dorothy said Louise was taking Blake's side like everyone else, that her own sister should support her instead of piling on. Louise said supporting her would mean telling her the truth, which was that she'd been cruel for years and finally got called out for it. They both went quiet when they noticed me standing nearby, and Louise gave me a small, sad smile before walking away. Richard walked us to our car as we were leaving and told Blake he said what needed saying. His voice was shaky when he admitted he'd been a coward for years, letting Dorothy hurt people because confronting her was too hard, and he didn't want to deal with her anger. Richard said things needed to change, and he was going to insist on it, though the way his voice wavered made it sound like he wasn't sure he actually would follow through. Blake thanked him and said he hoped they could all build something healthier, but I could tell he was skeptical about whether his dad would really stand up to Dorothy when it mattered. Richard hugged Blake tight and patted my shoulder awkwardly before heading back inside to deal with his wife. That night, Blake and I lay in bed processing everything that happened. He cried about finally standing up to his mother publicly, big silent tears running down his face while I held him. He worried he'd gone too far, that he'd ruined her retirement party, that she'd never forgive him, and he'd destroyed their relationship permanently. His whole body shook as he talked about feeling guilty even though he knew he'd told the truth. I held him close and reminded him that he'd spoken with kindness, that every word he said was true and necessary, that Dorothy's reaction was her responsibility and not his burden to carry. I told him he'd done the right thing protecting our family even though it was hard, that Lily deserved to grow up without watching her grandmother tear her mother apart at every gathering. Blake nodded against my shoulder and eventually his breathing evened out, but I could tell he'd be processing this for a long time. The next 3 weeks passed in complete silence from Dorothy's direction. Blake picked up his phone twice to call her, stared at her contact information, then set it down without dialing. The third time he actually pressed call, it went straight to voicemail, and he left a short message asking if she was okay. She didn't call back. Richard sent a text on the second Tuesday saying Dorothy was humiliated and furious, that she'd barely left her bedroom since the retirement party. He said she kept telling anyone who'd listen that her whole family had betrayed her, that Blake had ruined the most important day of her professional life. Blake read the message out loud to me while we sat at our kitchen table, his voice flat and tired. I told him his mother's feelings were her responsibility, that speaking the truth wasn't betrayal. He nodded, but I could see the guilt eating at him anyway, the way he kept checking his phone hoping she'd reach out. Amy called on a Thursday evening while I was grading papers and Blake was giving Lily a bath. She said she was proud of Blake for finally standing up to their mother, but worried about Thanksgiving coming up in a few months. Her voice got tight when she asked if we were prepared for Dorothy to either double down on her cruel behavior or play the victim at every gathering from now on. I told her we were setting boundaries either way, that Blake and I had already agreed we'd leave any family event where Dorothy made jokes at my expense. Amy went quiet for a moment, then said she'd do the same thing, that she was done watching her mother hurt people and pretending it was fine. We talked for another 20 minutes about how the family dynamics might shift, whether Richard would actually enforce any boundaries, if Dorothy was even capable of real change. Amy admitted she'd spent her whole childhood walking on eggshells around their mother's moods, always trying to be perfect enough that she wouldn't become the punchline. I thanked her for supporting us, and we agreed to check in regularly as the holidays approached. 4 weeks after the retirement party, Blake's phone rang while we were watching a movie, and Dorothy's name lit up the screen. He paused the show and answered, his whole body tense. I listened to his side of the conversation, watching his face cycle through surprise, caution, and something that looked like hope. Dorothy was asking if they could meet for coffee, just the two of them, to talk about what happened. Blake glanced at me and I nodded, knowing this conversation needed to happen. He told his mother he'd meet her, but that I was his priority, that if she wanted any relationship with him going forward, she needed to respect his wife. There was a long pause where I could hear Dorothy's muffled voice through the phone, smaller and shakier than I'd ever heard it. Blake said okay, and they set a time for Saturday morning at a coffee shop near his parents' house. When he hung up, he looked at me with uncertainty written all over his face. He said Dorothy claimed she wanted to talk about how to move forward, that her voice sounded different, almost scared. I told him to go and listen, but to hold firm on our boundaries, that feeling sorry for her couldn't mean accepting more cruelty. Saturday morning, Blake left for the coffee shop at 9 and didn't come home until almost noon. I spent those hours trying to focus on anything else, playing with Lily in the backyard, starting laundry, checking my phone every 10 minutes. When Blake finally walked through the door, he looked completely drained. His shoulders slumped and his eyes red. He dropped onto the couch and told me Dorothy had cried through most of their conversation, saying she didn't realize how much she'd hurt people over the years. She claimed she thought everyone understood it was just her personality, just her way of being funny, that she never meant actual harm. Blake said he asked her directly if she'd apologize to me, and she went silent for a long time before saying she didn't know if she could do that yet, that it felt too big. His voice cracked when he repeated that part, the admission that his mother still couldn't take full responsibility even after everything. He said she kept saying she was sorry, but then qualifying it, explaining why she did things, making excuses about her own difficult childhood. Blake told her that reasons weren't the same as justification, that understanding where behavior comes from doesn't make it acceptable. She asked him what he wanted from her, and he said basic respect for his family, no more jokes at anyone's expense, real relationships instead of performances. Dorothy said she'd try, but Blake said her try sounded more like maybe than a commitment. I sat beside Blake and took his hand, telling him I didn't need Dorothy's apology to move forward with my own peace. I'd already found that through my boundaries, through refusing to participate in her cruel games. What I needed was for family gatherings to be safe spaces for Lily and any future children we might have, places where Dorothy stopped performing cruelty as entertainment. Blake squeezed my hand and said Dorothy had claimed she'd try to be better, but her try had always been temporary before, lasting maybe one gathering before she slipped back into old patterns. We sat there together processing the conversation, both of us wanting to believe she might actually change, but neither of us quite trusting it. Blake said he told his mother that our boundaries were permanent, that we'd walk out of any event where she crossed lines, and she'd nodded but looked terrified at the prospect of actually losing access to us. I told Blake that fear might be what finally creates real change, that Dorothy had never faced actual consequences before now. Thanksgiving arrived with all of us on edge about what would happen. Dorothy insisted on hosting like she always did, and we drove to her house with an exit plan already discussed. Blake had his keys in his pocket ready to leave at the first sign of cruelty. We walked in expecting the worst, but found Dorothy subdued to the point of being almost meek. She greeted us quietly, hugged Blake carefully, and said hello to me without any jokes or loaded comments. The whole afternoon felt strange in a completely different way than before. Without her usual performance energy, every conversation felt awkward and stilted. Richard kept glancing between Dorothy and the rest of us like he was waiting for something to explode. Amy arrived with visible tension in her shoulders that only relaxed slightly when she saw Dorothy wasn't in attack mode. We sat down to eat, and Dorothy made normal conversation about the food, the weather, asking Lily about school without any cutting remarks about my parenting or teaching. The absence of her comedy routine left this weird vacuum where nobody quite knew how to interact. We were all so used to managing Dorothy's cruelty that her sudden normalcy felt like its own kind of trap, like we were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Lily noticed the change too and asked why Grandma was so quiet today, her small voice cutting through the awkward dinner conversation. Dorothy overheard, and her eyes filled with tears immediately. She stood up from the table abruptly and walked toward the kitchen, one hand covering her mouth. Richard followed her, and we could hear their muffled voices through the doorway, Dorothy's voice breaking into sobs, and Richard's low murmur trying to calm her. Blake and Amy and I sat frozen at the table while Lily looked confused about what she'd done wrong. I told Lily softly that Grandma was just having some big feelings, and it wasn't her fault. After several long minutes, Dorothy and Richard came back to the table, Dorothy's eyes red and her makeup smudged. She sat down and looked directly at me, her voice shaking when she said she was sorry for the joke she made at Lily's birthday party about the mailman. She said it was cruel and she shouldn't have done it, that she'd been thinking about it constantly since the retirement party. The table went completely silent, and I felt Blake's hand find mine under the table. I accepted Dorothy's apology but didn't pretend everything was suddenly fixed between us. I thanked her for acknowledging that her joke had hurt our family, that it was inappropriate to say in front of children and their parents. The rest of dinner continued in this stilted but peaceful way, everyone carefully navigating conversation without the usual landmines. When we got ready to leave, Dorothy hugged Blake tight and held on longer than usual, telling him she was trying to be better. Blake said he knew and that trying was all he was asking for, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes about how long this would actually last. We drove home in silence for the first few minutes before Blake said his mother looked genuinely shaken, that maybe the public humiliation at her retirement party had finally broken through her denial. I said I hoped so, but that we'd have to see if the change stuck beyond one holiday. Christmas planning started in early December and became this strange negotiation instead of Dorothy's usual announcements. She called Blake and asked what we'd be comfortable with rather than just telling us when and where to show up. She suggested having a smaller gathering at Richard's sister Polly's house instead of her typical big production at her own home. Blake was so surprised by her asking that he actually put the phone on speaker so I could hear. Dorothy's voice sounded uncertain, almost timid, as she listed options and asked for our input. The change in her approach was obvious, but it also felt performative in a different way, like she was playing the role of reformed person instead of actually being one. Blake told her Polly's house sounded fine and asked if she was sure she didn't want to host. Dorothy said she thought a change of location might be good for everyone, that maybe neutral ground would help. After they hung up, Blake looked at me and said he couldn't tell if his mother was genuinely trying or just performing a different character now. Christmas Day at Polly's house turned out surprisingly peaceful. Dorothy managed the entire day without a single cruel joke, though you could see how uncomfortable she was without her usual routine. She kept starting to say something, then stopping herself and redirecting to safer topics. She complimented my sweater and actually sounded genuine about it, telling me the color looked really nice. She asked about my students with what seemed like real interest, wanting to know what grade levels I taught and what subjects I enjoyed most. She played with Lily on the floor building blocks and didn't make any cutting remarks about my parenting or Lily's behavior. Watching her was like watching someone try to speak a new language badly but earnestly, fumbling through interactions without her practiced comedy shield. Richard looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years, actually smiling and joking around without the constant tension of waiting for Dorothy to say something horrible. Amy pulled me aside in the kitchen and whispered that she couldn't believe what she was seeing, that this was the longest she'd ever watched their mother go without being cruel to someone. I told her I was cautiously optimistic, but still waiting to see if Dorothy could maintain this beyond the holidays when family pressure wasn't quite so intense. After the presents were opened and Lily had fallen asleep on the couch surrounded by wrapping paper, Dorothy touched my arm and asked if we could talk privately. I followed her down the hall to Polly's study, a small room lined with bookshelves that smelled like old paper and coffee. Dorothy closed the door and stood there for a moment, her hands twisting together in a way I'd never seen before. She started talking about Blake's speech at her retirement party, how she'd replayed his words in her head every single day since then. Her voice got quiet when she said she hadn't realized how much damage she'd done over the years, that hearing it laid out so plainly in front of all those people had forced her to actually look at her behavior instead of dismissing it. She sat down heavily in Polly's desk chair, and her voice cracked when she admitted she didn't know how to be in a room without performing, that being funny was how she got attention from her own critical mother, who never thought anything Dorothy did was good enough. She wiped at her eyes and said she'd spent her whole life trying to be entertaining, because at least that got her noticed, even if the attention came from hurting other people. I sat down across from her and told her I appreciated her sharing that, but her childhood didn't excuse hurting me for 10 years. The words came out firmer than I expected, and Dorothy looked up at me with red eyes. I explained that Lily was watching how adults treat each other, learning what's acceptable in relationships, and I wouldn't let her grow up thinking cruelty was love, just because someone called it humor. I told Dorothy that her reasons for being mean might make sense to her, but they didn't erase the damage or make it okay. Dorothy nodded slowly and said she understood, that she wanted to be a better grandmother than she was a mother-in-law. She said she'd been thinking about Lily a lot, about how she didn't want her granddaughter to remember her as the mean lady who made everyone uncomfortable at family dinners. The conversation didn't fix everything between us, but it was the first real talk Dorothy and I had ever had without an audience she was performing for. She asked if we could try having coffee sometimes, just the two of us, to build something real instead of her usual act. I agreed to try, though I kept my voice careful and told her I was cautiously optimistic, but aware that people don't change overnight, especially at her age. Dorothy said she knew it would take time, that she'd probably mess up a lot along the way, but she wanted to at least try. We went back to the living room where Blake was cleaning up wrapping paper and gave each other a small nod that acknowledged something had shifted, even if we weren't sure what it meant yet. January brought a cold snap that kept everyone inside, and we saw Dorothy and Richard only twice that month, both brief visits that went smoothly. Dorothy seemed to be giving us space, showing up for a quick lunch one weekend and stopping by another time to drop off some books for Lily. Blake mentioned his dad had said something about Dorothy seeing a therapist, though Dorothy hadn't confirmed it and we didn't ask. The distance felt healthy rather than hostile, like we were all catching our breath after months of tension. I found myself not dreading family contact for the first time in years, though I stayed alert for signs that Dorothy was falling back into old patterns. In February, Dorothy called and invited us to dinner, actually asking what I'd like her to make instead of announcing her menu, I was so surprised I had to ask her to repeat the question. She prepared foods I'd mentioned liking over the years, things she'd probably heard me talk about but never bothered to remember before. She set the table without fanfare, no big production or performance about how hard she'd worked. The evening was full of normal family conversation about Blake's work, and Lily's school, and Richard's latest project in the garage. There was one moment where I saw Dorothy start to make a joke at my expense, her mouth opening with that familiar mean glint in her eye, but she caught herself mid-breath and redirected to a harmless story about her neighbor's cat instead. The shift happened so fast I almost missed it, but Blake squeezed my hand under the table and I knew he'd seen it too. After dinner, Dorothy asked if I wanted to see some old photos while Blake helped Richard with something in the garage. She pulled out albums from her childhood, pointing to picture after picture where her own mother stood with a critical expression, lips pressed thin and arms crossed. Dorothy talked about never feeling good enough, always performing for scraps of approval that never came. She said becoming the funny one was survival, that at least making people laugh got her some kind of attention, even if it wasn't the love she actually wanted. I saw the generational pattern clearly as she flipped through pages of family gatherings where everyone looked tense and unhappy. While it didn't excuse her behavior toward me, it explained the desperation behind it, the need to be the center of attention, because invisibility meant worthlessness in her family. Blake's birthday in March became a test of the new family dynamic, and Dorothy passed by keeping everything simple and kind. She gave him thoughtful gifts that showed she'd actually listened to what he liked, made his favorite meal without any commentary on my cooking, or how I probably couldn't make it as well as she could. She told stories about his childhood that were genuinely warm, talking about the time he built a treehouse that immediately fell apart and how proud she'd been of him for trying. Richard visibly relaxed as the evening went on without incident, his shoulders dropping from their usual tense position and his laugh coming easier. When we left, Dorothy hugged Blake tight and told him she was proud of the man he'd become, and I saw tears in his eyes as we walked to the car. Amy pulled me aside in the kitchen while Dorothy was cutting the birthday cake and said she was shocked by the change in her mother. She kept her voice low and told me their mother had never sustained this kind of behavioral shift before, that usually Dorothy's promises to be better lasted maybe a week before she reverted to her old patterns. Amy worried it was temporary, that Dorothy would eventually get comfortable again and slide back into cruelty disguised as humor. I shared her concern but told her we'd handle it if that happened, that our boundaries were permanent even if Dorothy's change wasn't. Amy nodded and said she was following our lead, that she'd also start leaving gatherings if Dorothy became cruel again. In April, Dorothy had her first slip at a family dinner when she made a joke about my weight that landed in sudden silence. Everyone froze with forks halfway to their mouths and I felt Blake tense beside me. But before anyone could say anything, Dorothy caught herself and her face crumpled. She apologized without being prompted, her voice shaking as she said she was sorry, and she shouldn't have said that. She looked genuinely distressed at falling back into old patterns, her hands trembling as she set down her napkin. The incident was uncomfortable and made everyone quiet for a few minutes, but her authentic remorse felt different from her previous dismissive responses where she'd just say she was kidding and everyone was too sensitive. That night, Blake and I lay in bed discussing whether Dorothy's change was real or sustainable. He said he wanted to believe she was genuinely trying, but 10 years of her behavior made him skeptical that this would last. I agreed that she was trying but might always struggle with her default patterns, that the instinct to make cruel jokes was probably too deeply ingrained to ever fully disappear. We decided that our boundaries would remain regardless, that we'd continue leaving situations where she was cruel, but we were willing to keep giving her chances as long as she was genuinely working on herself. Blake said he'd never expected to see his mother actually try to change, and even if she wasn't perfect, the effort itself meant something. May arrived with spring flowers and Lily's 6th birthday approaching fast. Dorothy called Blake 3 weeks before the party and asked if she could come, her voice careful and quiet like she was walking on glass. She wanted to know what kind of behavior we expected from her, what rules we had about how she should act around the children. Blake put her on speaker so I could hear, and I felt something shift in my chest at hearing her ask permission, instead of just announcing she'd be there. We told her the party was at a local park, that there would be other kids and parents, that any comments about appearance or ability or family resemblance were completely off limits. Dorothy said she understood and promised to be respectful, then asked what Lily wanted for her birthday, so she could bring something appropriate. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes but felt huge in its ordinariness, like we were building something new from scratch. The morning of the party, Dorothy and Richard arrived early with a wrapped gift and a plate of cookies they'd made together. Dorothy hugged Lily gently and told her happy birthday, without any jokes or comments about how fast she was growing or how much she looked like anyone. She helped us set up tables and hang decorations, chatting normally with other parents who arrived, introducing herself as Lily's grandmother without any performance or need for attention. During the party, I watched Dorothy play simple games with the kids, help serve cake, clean up spills, all while being kind and present without a single cutting remark. She complimented another mom's organization skills, laughed genuinely at the kids' silly jokes, and sat quietly when she wasn't needed instead of demanding to be the center of everything. When Lily opened Dorothy's gift and found a beautiful book about brave girls throughout history, Dorothy just smiled and said she hoped Lily would enjoy it. No commentary about my parenting or jokes about whether Lily could read at her level. The whole afternoon passed without incident, and I realized I'd been holding my breath the entire time waiting for Dorothy to slip back into her old patterns. After the other guests left and we were packing up the remaining decorations, Dorothy approached me near the car where I was loading boxes. She thanked me for letting her be there, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke. She said she knew she almost lost access to her granddaughter through her own behavior, that watching other grandparents interact normally with their grandkids at the party showed her what she'd been missing. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she talked about how much she loved Lily, how she didn't want to damage their relationship the way she'd damaged ours over the past 10 years. She admitted she'd been scared to come today, worried she'd mess up and say something cruel out of habit, that she'd practiced kind phrases in the mirror all week. I told her that whether she had a relationship with Lily was completely up to her choices going forward, that Lily deserved a grandmother who built her up instead of tearing people down for laughs. Dorothy nodded and wiped her eyes, saying she was trying so hard to be different, that her therapist had helped her see how her need for attention had poisoned everything good in her life. Richard walked over and put his arm around Dorothy's shoulders, telling us he was proud of how she'd handled herself today, that this was the woman he'd married 40 years ago finally coming back. We said goodbye with careful hugs, and I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe Dorothy's change was real enough to last. Summer brought regular family dinners at Dorothy and Richard's house, usually once every 2 weeks, and they were mostly peaceful in a way that felt strange after so many years of tension. Dorothy would occasionally slip into old patterns, starting to make a joke about my cooking or Blake's income, but she caught herself more quickly each time and redirected to something kind instead. At one dinner, she began saying something about my outfit looking like I'd shopped at a thrift store, then stopped mid-sentence and said actually, she liked the color on me and asked where I'd bought it. The interruption was awkward, but showed she was actively fighting against her default behaviors instead of just letting them fly. Richard had started giving Dorothy private signals when she was being cruel, a system they'd worked out in therapy where he'd clear his throat twice if she crossed a line. I noticed him doing it once when Dorothy made a comment about Lily's messy hair, and Dorothy immediately apologized and helped Lily put her hair in a neater ponytail without any more remarks. The change wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was sustained enough over multiple months to feel real instead of temporary. Blake and I discussed it after each dinner, analyzing whether Dorothy was genuinely different or just performing a new role, and we couldn't quite decide, but agreed the effort itself mattered. July hit with thick heat and the news that Blake and I had been keeping quiet for a few weeks. We invited Dorothy and Richard to dinner at our house and told them over dessert that we were pregnant with our second child, due in early spring. Dorothy's face lit up with pure joy. No jokes about my fertility or Blake's virility or whether we could afford another kid on our salaries. She stood up and hugged us both tight, saying she was grateful to be trusted with another grandchild, that she knew she had to earn that trust through her behavior every single day. Richard beamed and clapped Blake on the shoulder, then suggested we celebrate with a nice dinner out that weekend at the Italian place downtown. Dorothy asked how I was feeling, if I needed anything, whether Lily knew yet, and how she was handling the news. The questions were normal and kind, the kind any mother-in-law might ask, and I realized how starved I'd been for basic decency from her all these years. We spent the rest of the evening talking about baby names and nursery colors and how to prepare Lily for being a big sister, and Dorothy contributed ideas without any mean jokes or cutting remarks about our choices. The celebration dinner that weekend was at a nice restaurant with white tablecloths and candles on every table. Dorothy had dressed up and seemed nervous, fidgeting with her napkin as we ordered drinks and appetizers. After the food arrived, Richard tapped his glass and said Dorothy wanted to make a toast, and I felt my shoulders tense automatically waiting for whatever joke she'd prepared. But Dorothy stood up and her toast was genuinely warm and funny without any cruelty, talking about how excited she was for Lily to be a big sister, and how proud she was of Blake and me for building such a loving family. She made a gentle joke about how Richard had been a hopeless diaper changer when Blake was born, but she was sure he'd improved with age, and everyone laughed because it was actually funny instead of mean. Dorothy said she was learning it was possible to get attention through kindness instead of meanness, that making people feel good was better than making them laugh nervously while they hurt inside. Her voice cracked a little as she finished by saying she was grateful we kept giving her chances to be better, that she didn't deserve our patience, but she was trying to earn it every day. The toast got emotional applause from our table, and even from a few nearby tables who'd been listening, and Dorothy sat down looking relieved and happy in a way I'd never seen before. August brought a family vacation to a lake house that Dorothy and Richard rented for a full week, inviting us to stay with them in the big house with multiple bedrooms and a dock. Blake and I discussed whether we were ready for that much time together, whether Dorothy could maintain her new behavior for 7 straight days, but we decided to try it and set clear boundaries about leaving if things got bad. The week together tested everyone's patience in the normal ways families get annoyed with each other in close quarters, but mostly it went well. Dorothy fell into old patterns a few times, making a comment about how much food I was eating now that I was pregnant, but she caught herself within seconds and apologized genuinely. She'd say something like that she didn't mean it that way, that pregnancy made people hungry and she should know better than to comment on anyone's eating. Richard would give her the signal occasionally, and she'd course correct fast, showing she was actively monitoring herself instead of just letting whatever came to mind fly out of her mouth. Blake and I maintained our boundaries, taking walks alone when we needed space, putting Lily to bed ourselves without Dorothy's interference, but we also acknowledged the genuine effort Dorothy was making to be kind and respectful. One evening near the end of the week, Dorothy and I ended up sitting on the dock while Lily played in the shallow water near the shore, and Blake and Richard grilled dinner up at the house. The sun was setting orange and pink across the lake, and Dorothy was quiet for a long time before she spoke. She thanked me for not giving up on her completely after the retirement party, for giving her chances to prove she could change instead of just cutting her off forever. Dorothy admitted she'd been scared after that night, truly scared in a way she'd never felt before, that the silence from everyone at the party forced her to actually look at her behavior instead of blaming others for being too sensitive. She said she'd gone home that night and couldn't sleep for days, replaying every cruel joke she'd made over the years and finally seeing them for what they were, instead of what she'd pretended they were. I told her that accountability was necessary, that change only happened because she faced real consequences for her actions, that if we'd just kept absorbing her cruelty, nothing would have shifted. Dorothy nodded and watched Lily splash in the water, saying she wished she could go back and be kind from the beginning, that she'd wasted so many years being cruel when she could have had real relationships instead. Dorothy kept talking, her voice soft and honest in a way I'd never heard from her before. She said she'd been working with her therapist on why she needed to be the center of attention so badly, why she'd built her entire identity around being funny at others' expense instead of just being kind. Her therapist had helped her see that real connection came from being open and kind, not from making people laugh nervously while they hurt inside. Dorothy talked about her own mother who'd been cold and critical, how the only time she got attention as a kid was when she made people laugh, even if the laughs came from being mean about others. She'd learned early that being cruel and funny was better than being invisible, and she'd never unlearned it until now when she was almost 60 and had nearly lost everyone who mattered. The conversation felt genuine and raw, and I saw glimpses of the grandmother I wished Lily had known from the beginning, someone warm and real instead of always performing. I didn't forgive everything in that moment, but I understood her better, and understanding felt like a foundation we could maybe build something on. As summer ended and September arrived with cooler air and the start of a new school year, I found myself thinking about the past 10 months since Dorothy's retirement party. She'd made real, sustained changes that went beyond just a few weeks of good behavior before sliding back. Dorothy still wasn't perfect and probably never would be, still occasionally caught herself mid-cruel joke and had to redirect, but she was trying consistently instead of giving up when it got hard. She accepted accountability when she failed instead of making excuses or blaming others for being too sensitive, and that accountability made all the difference. Our relationship wasn't close, wasn't the warm mother-daughter bond some people had with their in-laws, but it was functional and getting healthier month by month. I could be in a room with Dorothy without bracing for attack, could bring Lily to visit without worrying about what cruel observations Dorothy would make about a 6-year-old's appearance or abilities. Blake was happier not being caught between defending me and loving his mother, and even Richard seemed more relaxed now that family gatherings didn't revolve around Dorothy's performances. The change felt real enough to trust, or at least real enough to keep trying. September also brought my students back to the school and the usual chaos of a new school year starting. Dorothy called one evening and asked about my students with genuine interest, wanting to know what grade I was teaching this year and what challenges I was facing. She listened as I talked about class sizes and curriculum changes, then surprised me completely by offering to volunteer in my classroom if I needed help. She said she had time now that she was retired, that she'd always admired teachers even though her jokes had never shown it, that maybe she could read to small groups or help with art projects or whatever I needed. The offer shocked me because it was such a complete reversal from her decade of jokes about teacher salaries, and my students probably being as dull as their teacher. I told her I appreciated the offer but wasn't ready for that level of involvement yet, that maybe we could revisit it later in the year once I saw what my needs were. Dorothy accepted my answer without getting offended or pushy, just said the offer stood whenever I was ready, and we moved on to talking about other things. After I hung up, Blake asked what Dorothy had wanted, and I told him about the volunteer offer. He looked as surprised as I felt, saying his mother had never shown interest in supporting my work before, only in tearing it down for laughs. We agreed it was progress, real tangible progress that showed Dorothy was thinking about ways to build me up instead of diminish me, and that shift felt bigger than any apology she could have made. One evening after Lily was asleep, Blake sat beside me on the couch and said he was proud of his mother. He admitted he never thought she could actually change, that he'd spent years just trying to manage her behavior instead of believing she might grow past it. Watching her put in the work with her therapist, seeing her catch herself before making cruel jokes, noticing how she asked questions about my day without setting up punchlines, all of it showed him something he'd lost hope in years ago. His voice got quiet when he said seeing his mother become someone he could respect again felt like getting a piece of his childhood back, the good parts he remembered before her humor turned mean. I held his hand and told him I was proud of him too, that his speech at the retirement party had been the catalyst for everything that came after. Blake shook his head and said I was the one who showed him boundaries were possible, that my quiet refusal to participate in Dorothy's cruelty had given him permission to stop defending it. October arrived with cooler weather and Dorothy's offer to host Thanksgiving again. Blake and I exchanged a look when she called to ask if we'd come, both of us remembering last year's strained meal where she was just starting to face her behavior. We said yes and showed up with Lily and a pumpkin pie, walking into Dorothy and Richard's house with less dread than I'd felt in a decade. Dorothy greeted us at the door with genuine warmth, hugging Lily and asking about her first grade class without any jokes about inherited intelligence. She'd set the table beautifully without the usual performative flair, like she was creating a welcoming space instead of a stage. Richard looked relaxed in a way I'd never seen him, moving through the kitchen, helping Dorothy without the tension that used to follow him at family gatherings. Amy arrived with a bottle of wine and immediately commented on how different the house felt, how peaceful everything seemed compared to the usual pre-dinner chaos of Dorothy preparing her material. Louise showed up with her husband and spent the first hour catching up with everyone, and I watched her study Dorothy carefully, like she was looking for signs of the sister she used to know. During dinner, Louise said something about how nice it was to see Dorothy so calm and present, and Dorothy paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at Louise and said Blake's speech at her retirement party had forced her to see herself clearly for the first time in years, that having her son stand up in front of everyone and tell the truth about her cruelty had been the hardest thing anyone had ever done for her. Dorothy's voice stayed steady as she said it was also the most necessary thing, that she'd needed someone to stop protecting her from consequences and make her face what she'd become. The table went quiet, everyone processing Dorothy's words, and I saw Richard reach over and squeeze her hand. Amy broke the silence by joking that we must be in some alternate universe where family dinner didn't end in awkwardness and tears. Everyone laughed, including Dorothy, and the sound was different from her usual performance laughter. She made a comment about having been terrible for years, her voice carrying real regret instead of deflection. The table went quiet again, people not sure how to respond, and Dorothy added that she was genuinely sorry and working every day to be better. She didn't make excuses or qualify the apology, just let it stand there as a simple truth. Amy looked at me across the table with raised eyebrows, and I could see her amazement that Dorothy was actually owning her past behavior without defensiveness. The rest of the meal passed easily, with normal conversation about work and school and holiday plans, and I realized I was actually enjoying being at Dorothy's table. As we were getting ready to leave, Dorothy asked if she could talk to me privately for a minute. We stepped into the hallway while Blake helped Lily with her coat, and Dorothy's hands twisted together nervously. She said she knew I would probably never fully trust her, that she understood she'd burned that bridge thoroughly over 10 years of cruelty. Her eyes filled with tears as she asked me to keep giving her chances to prove she was changing, that she saw now how much damage she'd caused and wanted to spend however many years she had left making real amends. I told her I was willing to keep trying, that the changes she'd made so far showed me she was serious about doing better. Dorothy nodded and wiped her eyes, thanking me for not writing her off completely. December brought Christmas planning, and Dorothy surprised us by suggesting we host at our house this year. She said she didn't want to always be the one controlling the gatherings, that maybe it was time to share that responsibility with the rest of the family. Blake and I agreed, and I spent the week before Christmas preparing our house for everyone. Dorothy showed up on Christmas Day as a helpful guest instead of a demanding matriarch, bringing the dishes I'd requested and setting them on the counter without commentary. She played with Lily on the living room floor, building a puzzle together and listening to Lily's stories about school without any need to redirect attention to herself. Richard pulled Blake aside at one point, and I saw them talking quietly by the window, Richard's hand on Blake's shoulder. Blake told me later that his dad had said he was seeing the woman he married 40 years ago starting to come back, that Dorothy's warmth used to be genuine before she turned it into performance. After Lily went to bed that night, Dorothy approached me with a wrapped box and said it wasn't really a gift, more of an acknowledgement of everything that had happened between us. I opened it carefully and found a journal inside, the pages filled with Dorothy's handwriting. She'd written out every cruel joke she could remember making about me over the past 10 years, with an apology written beside each one. The entries went on for pages, joke after joke with dates and contexts, showing me she'd actually cataloged the damage instead of dismissing it as just her sense of humor. The last page had a note saying she knew words couldn't undo the harm she'd caused, but she wanted me to know she remembered all of it and regretted every single moment. I sat there staring at the journal, completely overwhelmed by the gesture. This represented more accountability than I'd ever expected from Dorothy, more than the vague apologies she'd offered in the past. I looked up at her and said thank you, that this meant something real to me. I told her acknowledging specific harm instead of offering blanket apologies showed genuine understanding of what she'd done. Dorothy started crying and said her therapist had helped her see that real amends required specificity, that she needed to face exactly what she'd done instead of hiding behind the excuse that she was just joking. Blake came over and put his arm around his mother, and the three of us stood there in our living room having a moment I never thought possible a year ago. Winter progressed into the new year, and our family settled into a healthier rhythm that felt sustainable. Dorothy was still flawed and still made occasional mistakes, but she owned them quickly and worked to do better next time. Blake and I maintained our boundaries while acknowledging the real change she'd made, creating a family dynamic that was good enough even if it wasn't perfect. Dorothy called weekly to check in, asked about my students with genuine interest, and sent Lily cards in the mail with encouraging notes instead of backhanded comments. Richard seemed lighter too, like years of tension had lifted from his shoulders now that he didn't have to manage Dorothy's cruelty at every gathering. Amy started hosting dinners at her place, and Dorothy attended as a regular guest instead of the star of every show. In February, I went into labor 3 weeks early, and Blake drove me to the hospital while Dorothy came to get Lily. Our son was born healthy after 6 hours of labor, and Dorothy showed up at the hospital the next day with food and genuine support. She held the baby carefully and said he was beautiful, making no jokes about his appearance or comparisons to other family members. She took Lily for outings over the next few days so Blake and I could rest, bringing her back with stories about the park and the children's museum. Dorothy asked what we needed instead of telling us what to do, respected our parenting choices without commentary, and expressed gratitude for being included in these precious moments. Richard stopped by one evening and told Blake privately that his speech at the retirement party had saved their family, that he didn't know if Dorothy would have ever changed without that public reckoning. 3 months later, I stood at our kitchen window feeding the baby while watching Dorothy play gently with Lily in our backyard. She was pushing Lily on the swing set, laughing at something Lily said, being fully present without any need to perform or make everything about her. I realized I'd found something I never expected to have with my mother-in-law, a sense of peace built on firm boundaries and hard-won change. It wasn't the close relationship some people had with their in-laws, and it probably never would be, but it was real and functional and safe for my children. Blake came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, watching his mother and daughter together. He said Dorothy had called yesterday to ask if we'd come to dinner next week, and I said yes without the dread that used to accompany those invitations. The week after that conversation, Dorothy invited us for dinner on a Wednesday night. Blake squeezed my hand in the car as we drove over, both of us cautiously hopeful. When we arrived, Dorothy opened the door with a genuine smile instead of her usual performance entrance. She hugged Blake warmly and then turned to me, her expression soft. She asked how I was feeling after having the baby, if I was getting enough rest, if the recovery was going okay. The questions felt real instead of performative, like she actually wanted to know the answers. At dinner, Dorothy passed dishes without commentary about portions or my eating habits. She asked about my students and listened to my stories without making jokes about teacher salaries. When Lily talked about her class project, Dorothy engaged with real interest instead of finding ways to make it about herself. Blake relaxed beside me as the evening unfolded peacefully, his shoulders dropping from their usual defensive tension. Dorothy told stories about Blake's childhood that were actually sweet, about him building forts in the living room and reading books under blankets with a flashlight. She laughed at the memories without turning them into ammunition against anyone. Richard watched his wife with something like wonder, as if seeing a person he'd forgotten existed. When Lily asked Dorothy to play a board game, Dorothy said yes immediately, and spent an hour on the floor helping Lily move pieces and celebrating her wins. After the game, Dorothy helped clear dishes and asked if she could hold the baby while I ate dessert. She cradled him gently and talked to him softly, no jokes about his appearance or comparisons to other babies. As we were leaving, Dorothy walked us to the door and hugged me carefully, mindful of my still healing body. She thanked me for giving her another chance, her voice thick with emotion. She said she knew she'd burned a lot of bridges over the years and didn't expect me to forget everything, but she was grateful I was willing to let her try. I told her tonight was really nice, and I meant it. Spring arrived slowly, bringing warmer weather and longer days. I found myself thinking about the journey from that awful retirement party to this cautiously hopeful present. Dorothy still struggled sometimes with her old patterns, catching herself mid-joke and redirecting to something kind instead. I maintained protective boundaries, never fully relaxed in her presence but no longer braced for constant attack. Blake seemed lighter these days, no longer caught between defending me and managing his mother's feelings. He told me one night that he'd spent years wishing his mom would change, but never believing it was possible, and now he was watching it actually happen. Lily started asking to visit Grandma Dorothy more often, noticing that time with her grandmother felt different now. Dorothy sent cards in the mail with encouraging notes for Lily, telling her how proud she was of her schoolwork and her kindness. Richard called Blake sometimes just to talk, their conversations easier without the tension of managing Dorothy's next performance. Amy hosted family dinners at her place, and Dorothy attended as a regular guest instead of commandeering every gathering. The change wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was real and sustained enough to feel permanent. I still watched Dorothy carefully during gatherings, still noticed when she started to slip into old habits, but she was catching herself more quickly now. Her therapist was apparently helping her understand why she needed constant attention, why she'd built her entire identity around being funny at other people's expense. Dorothy was learning that real connection came from being genuine instead of performing, from building people up instead of tearing them down for laughs. In May, we gathered at our house to celebrate Lily's 7th birthday. Both sets of grandparents came, along with Amy and Richard. Dorothy arrived with a thoughtful gift and immediately joined the other adults in setting up decorations. She helped arrange chairs and set out snacks without any need to direct or control the party. And when the children arrived, Dorothy played games with them genuinely, getting down on the floor for musical chairs and helping organize a treasure hunt in the backyard. She served cake and helped clean up spills without making jokes about mess or chaos. I watched her interact with all the children, kind and patient with each one, and realized this was the grandmother I'd always hoped Lily would have. After the party ended and the other guests left, Dorothy helped us clean up the remaining decorations. She complimented how we'd organized everything and thanked us for including her. As she was leaving, Dorothy pulled me aside and said something that caught me off guard. She told me she was grateful I'd held firm boundaries instead of just accepting her abuse year after year. She said being forced to change had been the best thing that ever happened to her, even though it was incredibly painful at the time. Dorothy admitted she probably would have kept destroying relationships forever if Blake hadn't spoken truth at her retirement party, if I hadn't stopped reacting to her cruelty. She said she'd lost years with her family being someone she didn't even like, and now she was learning to be someone worth knowing. That night, I tucked Lily into bed and she smiled up at me sleepily. She said Grandma Dorothy was so much more fun now that she was nice, that she liked spending time with her. The simple statement hit me hard as I realized my daughter would grow up with mostly positive memories of her grandmother, instead of the painful ones I'd accumulated over 10 years. Lily would remember Dorothy playing games and telling sweet stories, not making cruel jokes disguised as humor. She'd remember a grandmother who built her up instead of one who tore people down. I kissed Lily's forehead and turned out her light, then stood in the hallway trying to process the emotion washing over me. Blake found me there with tears streaming down my face and he pulled me close asking what was wrong. I told him these were happy tears, that I was amazed our family had actually changed. He held me tight and said he was amazed too, that he'd never believed his mother was capable of real growth. We stood there together thinking about how enforcing boundaries and speaking truth had created the transformation we needed. Our family wasn't perfect and never would be, but it was finally built on respect instead of cruelty disguised as humor, and that was everything I'd fought for.